Second, I'm just testing if I can hear in my sync computer. Okay, sorry, I was having some audio issues there.
Cami, so that you know, I did my presentation and I added to the Canva. And what I did in the script, I'm not sure you will be following the script, but I marked the slides to make it easier for you to move, okay?
Do we know where is Sylvia?
I don't know, but she may be just finishing stuff. But it's fine, it's only Justine and me. She doesn't need to be here today, but I'm sure she'll come. Just before we admit, who is a Ponpen Kongjakit from Asia?
He's an Asian member, yeah. He was here yesterday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice to see people from yesterday returning.
Yes. I don't know if we should admit any of the people who are speaking today.
Hmm?
We have quite a few people, so I don't know if we should admit any of the ones that are presenting in case they want to check something.
Let me
Before.
admit them. I'll
Okay.
admit them. And I think we can just put a message in the.
Yeah, Lena just did in the waiting room.
Radhika, yeah. So, okay, I've admitted. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I'm just first admitting you guys, the
Hi.
speakers.
Hi.
Let me just see. Hi, Fulade Singh, Lebo Radhika, Rose, Francisca. Okay, so we are missing at the moment Stephanie and Thiago.
No, she's here. I just
Stephanie's here.
Pamela? Stephanie's here.
Yeah.
Okay, so only Thiago.
Hello.
I'm gonna text
Hello.
Thiago.
It's okay, right? I think we can start admitting people.
We can.
Yeah, because Thiago is not speaking now. So
No, we totally can.
so can I?
Yes.
Elena, you're going to put the text and all that in the chat box, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon.
Hello.
Hi.
Good morning again.
morning.
Hi again. How is everyone?
Hi, good evening.
Good morning.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello, morning.
Morning.
Okay, so Cami, it's all set up with translation, right?
Yes, we're all set.
Okay,
We can
perfect.
start anytime.
Okay. So Justine, whenever you're ready.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Justine Di Maio. I'm the program manager for Europe and the MENA region at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Before I introduce today's session, I would just like to remind everyone that the workshop is being translated into Arabic, English, French, and Spanish, and you can choose your language at the bottom of the screen. Also, please remember to keep yourself muted when not speaking. And if your connection is bad, please try to turning off your video. If you are having technical problems during the meeting, please reach out to Tech Host through a private chat. We anticipate the workshop lasting about 4 hours. And if we do go over slightly, which sometimes happens, please know that this and all our virtual programming is recorded and made available on our website for future viewing and sharing. If you wish to submit a comment or a question, you may do so at any time in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. Elena Del Hoyo has also posted is posting the meeting's full agenda in the Arabic, Spanish, English, and French. We will be also posting Padlets for session, which will also be in the chat box. Padlets are like virtual bulletin boards. You can click on the links to open them. Finally, at the end of the day, you will be directed to a survey, we would be so grateful to have you fill out, as they are very crucial to our evaluation and future programming. So today I'm very happy to introduce the second day of our Correcting the Record Global Workshop, which is part of the Coalition Global efforts to amplify our regional work and bring our collective voices and experiences together to tackle some of the most pressing social and human rights issues affecting our communities and societies today. Yesterday, we had very rich and brilliant presentation and discussions. Ajna Jusic from Bosnia and Herzegovina, our keynote speaker, shared a personal story of a child born as a result of rape and her work within our organization, the Forgotten Children of War Association, to counter institutional silence, stigma, and discrimination against these children by centering their voices and regaining ownership on their stories. Then Lebo Marishan and Radhika Yetarachi, our two Correcting the Record project mentors, explained the different approaches the Correcting the Record project partners have taken to tackle contemporary challenges of racial discrimination, exclusion, and violence in their communities, and to feminize historical narratives. They shared key lessons learned and initial impacts. They stressed the importance of reassessing their organizational objectives, values, and practices, and seeing critically the space they work for, and also the importance of adopting co-creation with their community as a principle of engagement. At the end of the day, Christian Julius shared the experience of District 6 in developing a community museum in South Africa. District 6 adopted the Correcting the Record methodological choice decades ago. From its start, it was guided by the idea of an organic community moving along with a museum that do not talk about the community, but with the community. Christian shared some of the best practices of a museum and raised important challenges they are facing today, highlighting that the Correcting the Record takes time. It's a process that adapts to the context, to the change of society, to the change of the community. And for that, it requires a continuous commitment from the organization, a commitment to embrace this practice in the long run. Today, we will introduce you to the Correcting the Record methodology and the project partners from Brazil, Chile, Taiwan, Uganda, Trinidad and Tobago will present their case studies. We will end the workshop with a facilitated discussion on the first step of our methodology, which is assessing the gaps, as this step lays the foundation for correcting the record in your organization. So now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, JJ, who will introduce you to the correcting the record methodology. JJ, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Justine. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Camille, I think you can just, it's fine. I think we can stay there. So thank you. I'm very happy to be here to finally be able to present to all of you our correcting the record methodology in light of the journey that led to it. It's been nearly a year that we've been working on it collectively, a lot of work and dedication from all, so it's really exciting. I hope to make it not so dry, and please let me know if you have questions at any point. Also, we can respond even later in the day when we get to the workshop. So why do we need to correct the record? Now, correcting the record, the project emerged at a time when museums and memory institutions around the world are being called to reassess their real value to society and the communities they serve, requiring deep self-assessment and asking hard questions. At the same time, the world is facing backlashes in democratic values, radicalization, and deep societal divides, all underpinned by strong denialist and relativist movements, breeding ground for intensified hatred, violence, and discrimination to take hold. Correcting the record was conceptualized to expand the impact of sites of conscience in countering these phenomena by fostering more inclusive historical narratives. Correcting the record amplifies members' unique expertise in the documentation, oral history collection, and community engagement to confront what author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called the single stories, simplistic and often false narratives that end up excluding the experiences and needs and voices of minority groups, ultimately contributing to divisive rhetoric, negative stereotypes, and discrimination, hatred, and violence, as we said. I know we touched on some of these points yesterday, but I think it's important to bring them back as we dive into what this methodology is. So we work through peer exchange, one-on-one mentoring, and capacity building to develop and document a one-of-a-kind methodology that is collectively made by all of us and allow sites of conscience around the world to recalibrate their repositories in order to amplify these marginalized voices, promote more inclusive public narratives, and mitigate discrimination and exclusion, be it through collecting, archiving, research, documentation, preservation, interpretation as well, or display. This initiative aims to help sites of conscience to correct the record of these official historic narratives and foster new understandings of experiences of those whose voices are typically not included in historical narratives. So we move to the next slide, please. Well, what do we mean by repositories, by sites of conscience repositories? So sites of conscience as organizations ranging from historic sites and museums to archives and memory initiatives are rooted in their communities. They serve as repositories of collective memory, heritage, knowledge, information, local identity, social capital, among others. So sites of conscience repositories may comprise collections of artifacts, bibliographic materials, oral history archives, documents, research registers, digital collections, but also their interpretation and display in exhibitions, cultural education, cultural and educational programs, and more, including the processes. Correcting the record in sites of conscience implies, therefore, revisiting these organizations' repositories holistically, as well as their practices from collecting and archiving, research, documentation, and preservation to how they choose to curate, represent, display these repositories in order to identify gaps in their approaches to building and interpreting repositories in an inclusive, equitable, and holistic manner. So next slide, please. The goals and objectives of this project. The main goal is to strengthen sites of conscience capacities to build and interpret their repositories in an inclusive, equitable, and holistic manner. This is our overarching goal. The objectives are, we have a main objective, which is to develop skills and comprehensive methodology for sites of conscience to build and interpret these repositories inclusively and equitably. By piloting 6 correcting the record case studies. So this was the project. This is how we got to the methodology. We wanted to pilot this framework, which we created by piloting also these case studies that use the framework in order to get to a final methodology. So these case studies, they identify gaps in sites of conscience approaches and practices to build and interpret repositories in an inclusive and equitable holistic manner. They identify gaps in sites of conscience skills and tools to fill in these gaps. They develop skills and actions to fill these gaps, and they help you evaluate and ensure the gaps are filled in the short, medium, and long term, and also to ensure you produce a correcting the record methodology that can be applied by all sites of conscience. So this was the aim of the greater project that we developed throughout this year. Next slide, please. So how did we go from a correcting the record framework to a correcting the record methodology? So the correcting the record framework was the first step. It was developed through a collaboration between the Global Networks team. Sorry, I'm just checking that we by the Global Networks team and the correcting the record mentors, Lebo Marishani and Radhika Hetiarachi. And it was the first step in this journey, a methodological skeleton that aimed to provide a roadmap for the development and implementation and testing of the 6 correcting the record case studies, which were the base to develop this comprehensive sites of conscience correcting the record methodology, as I said. So framework was the first step, the skeleton that we followed. The correcting the record case studies, they refer to all the work that was undertaken by the 6 sites of conscience in Brazil, Chile, Trinidad and Tobago, Uganda, Mauritius, and Taiwan to identify and address the gaps in their repositories by applying this framework, this skeleton methodology. And now the correcting the record methodology that I'm going to quickly present refers to the final sites of conscience product, the final correcting the record methodology, which is being grounded in the collective experiences developed through the correcting the record case studies, the expertise of the mentors, of the coalition staff, of other member sites, and also centering the perspectives and lived experience of discriminated and marginalized communities. So next slide, please. I think an important aspect for the purpose of the project is that we created also a little bit of conceptual terminology to help us guide the project. So if you use this methodology, you will encounter these kind of explanations throughout. But one of the important thing and crucial key step, we'll talk about it later today, in this terminology was for us to identify who are the primary community, referring to your organization's primary audience, community, stakeholders, that one that is your focus in your museum. Who are the discriminated, marginalized communities who are victims of systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination on the basis of their identities, such as race, ethnicity, gender, identity, and expression, and etc., that are also linked to your primary community. And in the case of the Correcting the Record project, your target community is the target group that you will choose for the purposes of the Correcting the Record case study that you would like to develop to follow this methodology. It is a specific discriminated, marginalized community within your primary community that you will choose to focus your case study to fill the gaps in your repositories. And lastly, we also identify audiences. We are using the word audiences here as the variety of communities and publics that your organization interacts with and or aims to reach throughout your Correcting the Record case study. So the larger group that goes beyond your primary community. So next slide, please. The Correcting the Record methodology, it was structured in 3 phases. Phase 1, assessing the gaps. Phase B, so phase not 1, phase A, phase B, filling the gaps, and phase C, ensuring the gaps are filled. Next slide, please. Just double check, we're good, yeah. Because I'm following my notes here. So phase A, assessing the gaps, it aims to identify, to help sites of conscience identify gaps in their organization's approaches, practices, skills, and tools to building records and interpreting repositories in an inclusive, equitable, and holistic manner. As such, it involves your organization's board members, directors, staff, and primary communities. So we try to make this as inclusive and participatory as possible. Okay, so the next slide, please. The steps that we follow in phase A, so in this methodology, it focuses in 3 interdependent areas in this assessment, which must be analyzed together. Your overall organizational practices, preservation and communication, which cover a lot of the functions of your organizations, which can be collections and archives, education, conservation and care, curation, interpretation, research, documentation, display, exhibitions, cultural programs, and many other functions, and your internal and community skills and tools. I also want to say that from these functions, not all organizations that are sites of conscience cover all these functions and activities, and it's not a problem. It doesn't matter. We just wanted to make it as comprehensive as possible for you as sites of conscience to be able to use the parts that actually suit you better from the methodology that we created. So we drive you through an assessment of your organizational practices, an assessment of your repositories, programs, and activities, an assessment of your skills and tools. And lastly, we ask you to write an assessing the gap diagnostic. So throughout the first 3 steps, the methodology presents you with questions that will help you dive into a deep evaluation of your community representativeness and engagement and your ethical approaches in light of each of these 3 areas that covers their points 1 to 3. Some examples of the questions that we bring to you are, for example, who is your primary community? And does your organization welcome the full diversity of people in your primary community? Does your current audience, staff, and board members reflect the diversity of your primary community? Does your content and programs reflect the diversity of your primary community? Does your organization make it easy for your primary community to take part in decision-making? And at what level? Do you have the capacity to provide a safe space and support for difficult narratives of the nature of gender-based violence, racial crimes, atrocities, through your practices and approaches? At which stage of development are you there? And are you aware of any ethical dimensions of correcting the record within your organization? Are you aware of intended and unintended harm, gender dynamics, selection bias, contested narratives, and so forth? So we guide you through questions that will help you look deeply, not alone, but in cooperation with your internal people internally from your organization and externally from your communities. So at the end of phase A, which we think is the most challenging phase of the project, the information gathered and documented in the steps, we ask you to write an assessing the gap diagnostics document with key findings about the gaps and needs in your organization's approaches, practices, skills, and tools to building records and interpreting repositories in an inclusive, equitable, and holistic manner. And this phase, what we want is to force you to articulate definitions and concepts about your repositories, practices and approaches that will lead to clarity about the gaps that you have. And as such, we understand this is actually the most key part of the work. So next slide, please. So phase B, filling the gaps. Based on your assessing the gap diagnostics and the process you undergo, now you are called to identify a target community to focus on, stakeholders that may or may not be part of this target community or your primary community, as well as your strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and intended results, which will then help you define how you, together with your target community and stakeholders, will create a case study project that will allow you to create a blueprint for your organization to then in the present and future, be able to correct the record. So we want this case study to become this blueprint for you, to be an exercise that when all its challenges and difficulties points you to what are the strategies you can start implementing in your organization to correct the record going forward. Next slide, please. So your correcting the record case study should have a clear definition of the changes you want to foster by correcting the record in your repositories, which will in turn inform your goal, objectives, and results of your case study. It must be clearly, you must clearly state now in this stage of the project, what are your guiding values that will underpin your project and why they matter, what outputs will be produced in this case study, and how they will be presented and socialized. And we also prompt you to consider the skills, tools, and methods you will employ, and encourage your case study to cut across more than one repository or one area of practice in your organization to ensure that all the benefits filter and trickle horizontally and vertically at all levels of your organization. And after completing your case study definitions, steps, we will guide you on considerations on how to adopt a truly co-creative practice with your communities and stakeholders during the implementation phase of your case study. So we encourage you to identify team members that have adequate skills and as well as target community representativeness based on your goals, objectives, value strategies, skills and outputs. And the skills required may range from research to storytellers, artists, photographers, community experts, conservationists. It's a host of different skills that each project is one project, each context is one context, and no one size fits all, but this is just a little sampling. And finally, we give you hints on how to focus on deep target community engagement through co-creation rather than token, superficial, partial participation, and to ensure co-ownership and to be flexible to correct your actions, always having the goals and objectives in mind. Next slide, please. Then lastly, phase C goes more or less in parallel with phase B, and it's called ensuring the gaps are filled. And what we want with this phase, which is a supporting phase, and it's focused on two very important aspects of people-centered project development and implementation. One is ensuring we understand the risks of the correcting the record case study at hand, and that we monitor these risks throughout the entire process and mitigate them. And also that we monitor and evaluate to ensure your repositories are constantly in check and that you are identifying gaps in your practices and keeping your communities engaged and that you're meeting the goals of your project. Next slide, please. In phase C, the risks we discuss can be connected to the context in which you operate, to the context in your country, addressing issues that are considered taboo, what kind of reactions or retaliations the case study can cause in your community or society. It asks you questions like, is re-traumatization a risk? Who faces the risk? And how do we mitigate them? We invite you to think through this with your stakeholders and community and identify who carries the most risks and what can be done to eliminate or mitigate the risks. And once you're correcting the record case study has been fully implemented, and we don't say evaluate only at the end, but specifically once it's fully implemented, we're asking you, how will you know you have filled the gap and fostered the change you envisioned? So go into the monitoring and evaluation aspect of it. It's a key tool to ensure your repositories are constantly in check and that you are identifying the gaps and you are making sure your goals are there in front of you. So this is also a vital part of the correcting the record methodology, sustainability and adaptability. We encourage you to ensure your target and primary communities become allies in this evaluation process by adopting ongoing evaluation practices for your correcting the record case study actions from inception and based on your intended goals, objectives, outputs, and outcomes. To ensure you define your indicators to measure the impacts, to document your correcting the record case study actions on an ongoing basis, that you allow for evaluation midstream, that documenting and reviewing after each relevant phase or action, and that you learn from the evaluation results and adjust your correcting the record case study actions in response to your evaluation results. And that for that, you will involve and share the evaluation results with your target community and partners, and also with your primary communities. So this was just a very compressed and condensed run through the methodology. I know that it's a lot and there's a lot of terminology, but I think the intention that we have today, it will be repeated many times. You now will listen from the presentation of the 6 sites of conscience who implemented the framework and the case studies and now are helping us get to this final methodology. And they will be repeating some of these terms and referring to some of these phases. So I think slow, step by step, it will sink in, and we hope by the end of today you have a much clearer understanding of what the methodology entails and what's its use and how it can be applied. So with that, I will give the word back to Justine.
Many thanks, JJ. Thank you for this very clear and comprehensive presentation of the Correcting the Record project and final product, the Correcting the Record methodology. So now I would like to introduce our next speakers, Pamela Ipenza, Francisca Davalos, Folade Mutota, and Rose Kigere, who will be presenting their case studies on feminizing narratives, as well as the next session moderator, Radhika Yetarachi. Radhika, the floor is yours, and just want to mention that in the interest of keeping time, we will communicate with you via a chat box to let you know how your presentation timing is going. Radhika.
Thank you. Thank you, Justine. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Okay. Right. So thank you very much to everybody for coming today as well. Today is the second day of the workshop, as everybody has been talking about already. Just a reminder that this workshop is about sharing the lessons that we learned from the pilot initiative of Correcting the Record, which helped develop a replicable methodology working with 6 organizations. So today, this was a year-long project, and we revisited the organization's practice and identified gaps in their approaches when building and interpreting repositories in an inclusive, equitable, and holistic manner. So the participating sites were divided into 2 thematic cohorts, one focusing on feminizing narratives and the other looking at underrepresented ethnic and racial narratives. So this particular session we are going to be part of right now is with the 3 sites of conscience that focus on correcting the record by feminizing their narratives. So the 3 sites, after identifying the gaps in their approaches, their practices, and their community representation, pilot case studies with their communities, with their target groups, and created a blueprint on how to fill those gaps through organizational, technical, and community engagement practices that they've chosen. So what we will do now is to focus on the action research methodology that they have used and the lessons that they have learned to understand how each of these organizations that I mentioned yesterday and the various stages of the methodology and of practices that they used have succeeded in learning from the methodology, but also have succeeded in carrying out the case studies. So the 3 groups, the 3 organizations, sorry, that we're talking to today would be, they're all sites of conscience members. And the first is the Museo de la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos in Chile. The second is the Women's Institute for Alternative Development in Trinidad and Tobago. And the third, but not least, is the Women's Rights Initiative in Uganda. So what I will do now is to briefly introduce all of these organizations and their speakers. And then I will invite each of the speakers to speak. So I will introduce all three of them first. This session is being translated into Arabic, English, and Spanish. You can choose the language at the bottom of the screen. And I will ask the panelists to speak slow so that the translators are able to simultaneously translate as you speak. I will give you a 3-minute chat box when your time is nearly up. And I'm going to ask all of the others to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. So to introduce the 3 speakers, or the 4 speakers actually, because I believe the museum will be, there will be 2 speakers. So from the Museo de la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos, again, I'm so sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name, in Chile. It's Pamela Ipenza Mayo. Pamela is a cultural manager, designer, and feminist. She holds a degree in visual arts, a master's in book publishing, and a diploma in memory, education, and human rights. Her work is centered on the management and production of projects on memory and gender within the field of culture, arts, and heritage. She currently works as a coordinator of the Memory and Feminism line at the Museum of Memory and Human Rights. Francesca Davalos Bachelet is in charge of the international relations of the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Chile. She is an anthropologist and earned her master's in human rights and social policy from the Universidad Nacional de San Martin in Argentina. She has developed research regarding right to the city, gendered citizenship, and the role of women in slums. She's part of the Sites of Conscience Ex Nido 20, a former torture and enforced disappearance center in Santiago. Folade Mutota represents the Women's Institute for Alternative Development, or WINAD, from Trinidad and Tobago. Folade is an action-oriented strategic thinker whose career to date has been distinguished by building successful partnerships for the development of society, utilizing and creating genius of all its peoples. Mutota holds a master's degree in business administration. She's a social development advisor and lobbyist, providing services to state and civil society organizations nationally, regionally, and internationally. Folade is a womanist and global leader in the arms and disarmament communities. She is also one of the 3 founders and executive director of the Women's Institute for Alternative Development, which was established in 1999 to advance the rights of women and girls. Folade became a member of the Distinguished Society of Trinidad and Tobago in 2017 as a recipient of the Medal for the Development of Women, awarded by the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. She is also a member of the Forum on the Arms Trade. Folade has successfully led Caribbean civil society from 12 countries in lobbying efforts at multilateral meetings to benefit CARICOM states in international cooperation for the last 20 years. She is committed to service to the people of Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. Rose Kigere from the Women's Rights Initiative in Uganda is a Ugandan feminist, human rights activist, advocate for the rights of vulnerable girls and women. She pursued degrees in human resource management and social work and development. Rose is a co-founder and executive director of the Women's Rights Initiative, an action-oriented organization working with women and youth in the eastern region of Uganda. Through programs in human and women's rights awareness, advocacy, and education, they promote leadership development, sexual and reproductive rights, and economic empowerment. Through Worry, she built and runs the largest women's shelter, the Nyonga Women's Shelter. She has 14 years experience of working with women and girls, especially in uplifting them with leadership skills, economic empowerment, and reproductive health and rights. Rose is passionate about ending violence against women and girls, loves flower gardening, self-care, and having hearty laughter with friends. Rose is an entrepreneur with passion to support women and girls and is the founder of Star Durable Pads which is a social enterprise that produces eco-friendly, reusable pads aimed to support girls within rural schools have access to menstrual health materials. And so this is our wonderful panel today. And with this introduction, I would like to ask Pamela and Francesca to start us off. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you for the introduction. We'll be doing our presentation in Spanish, so I'll be turning to Spanish now. Bueno, en primer lugar,
Well, first and foremost,
no puedo cambiar el Museo de la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos se encuentra localizado en
the Museo de la Memoria de Derechos Humanos, Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Chile, is located in a space that seeks to make visible human rights and violations that took place in the Chilean state and the dictatorship in 11 September in 1973 and March 3 in 1990. It's going to be 50 years next year, and seeks to dignify the victims and their families as a means to carry out a symbolic reparation, and also raise or carry out or foster a reflection and debate on the importance and respect and tolerance to avoid these events from happening again, and to strengthen this through education and, of course, art and culture in general. So this space seeks to contribute to the culture of human rights and, of course, the democratic values, and make them an ethical foundation for coexistence. It receives on average 200,000 people a year. Well, due to the pandemic, of course, this number decreased, but it has been slowly picking up. The flow of people, visitors have been picking up. It was inaugurated in 10 March 2010 by the President Michelle Bachelet back then, and following the recommendations of the reports of the Truth Commissions in Chile regarding the reparation proposals as part of the obligations of the government around the guarantees of non-repetition. Here is an explicit recognition of memory that involves, on the one hand, recognition or acknowledgement of the memory sites and other spaces that symbolize this commitment and the non-repetition guarantees, and that, in addition, relate to the or are linked to the commissions of truth. So through objects and different documents and files, the recent past of Chile is displayed, and this document collection is part of the main sample and are the product of donations that the museum receives. The museum does not buy. It has no procurement or purchasing policy. Everything is part of donations by individuals. Likewise, it is important to mention that the museum is national, and it depends on a private nonprofit organization, specifically not to rely or depend on the government's decisions, but we receive public or government funding through the budget devoted by the Ministry of Arts, Culture, and Patrimony, set out by the government, but there is no such thing as a law that states it should be a constant budget for this. It is discussed on a yearly basis. This year, we had no budget for the museum, but it has been resumed once again. But it is important in order to preserve memory, human rights in Chile, and I suppose it's similar, and it works similarly where you are. Everything is under discussion in terms of who are the ones willing to move forward when it comes to justice and reparation. Regarding the key findings in the Accessing the Gap exercise, it's important to mention that after 12 years of the creation of the museum, there are different initiatives that have been started that deepen this thematics or these topics regarding human rights in the present, linking the past and the present. And this is a key part of our work and makes evident the will of expanding and updating all the potential readings around this past and present approach, and its position is a key element from the outlook of feminist genres that want to get involved with this project to link the problems of the past with the current demands of the present. And it is also necessary, and more than ever, it is necessary to defend human rights, to stand for human rights. So this enables this encounter of different generations of the past, of today and tomorrow, and brings together the mobilizations for the fight for human rights. And on the other hand, in the context of Chile in 2018, we had the feminist, what we call the Feminist May in universities, or the female strikes that led all the society to reflect upon inequality in terms of gender and education as well. And this permeated also into the museum, meaning that the context plus the political and institutional will at that point enabled for a path for the constitution of this line of memory and feminism, which is the lifeblood of the Correcting the Records project. The purpose is to make visible the memory of women's social organizations in the Chilean feminist movement that fought for the rights of women to address the effective violations that took place during the dictatorship. This led to the creation of pedagogical approaches and educational approaches, not only to address the immediate and direct experience and the historical memory, but also regarding general processes and individual processes that feminist practices go through. In other words, a change of paradigm is suggested. It's not only about building in the feminist component of women through a picture of an object into the museum and the main exhibition, but a whole perspective of the feminist gender that is translated into transformative processes in a cross-cutting fashion, engaging organizational practices and so forth. So after a series of diagnostics or processes that Pamela will touch on, we realized the need of proposing a narrative that included a critical vision of gender and powers involved. So through this assessing the gap phase, we identified the following gaps. On the one hand, there's a lower representativeness of victims and their relatives in decision-making processes in the museum. For the museum, it was also a challenge to identify the primary community, and we thought about a ring-based or concentric rings-based model. So in the first ring, we had the victims and the survivors, because it's their voices and their memories that we are seeking to represent. So these voices have been represented in the are not truly represented in the different decision-making processes of the museum and the directory of the museum or the collections. So in the latest years, there has been a closeness with the relatives of victims, opening windows and spaces for this memory-based activities. On the other hand, there was another gap, which is a lack of representativeness of new generations, a second and third ring, so to speak, of the community that there is heterogeneity, but it is made up mainly by the younger generations that were not part of this dictatorship and the coup. So it's a challenge the museum has, how to building those problems and convey this to the audience and involving new generations, of course. And third, in the main exhibit, how to make visible voices and memories historically and systematically silenced, such as, but not limited to, women and other groups. So it's difficult to include all these different voices because in this main sample that was defined before it was inaugurated, and this content has been updated, but there are some modifications that need to be made. Having said this, in the assessing the gap phase, the need of including a greater heterogeneity of narrations was determined in order to include all these voices, considering the different political views for men and women, generally related to gender equity. And well, to close with, the museum closes activities with the different topics. And this year there was memory and women, but it also guides specific activities or targets certain activities to reduce this representativeness related gaps. So the March 8th, we celebrate the International Day Against Women, women-based violence or violence against women. So this is the main target. But this gap assessing phase or assessing the gap phase enabled us to see all these gaps that we spotted around women and the participation engagement of community, those groups that were not part of the dictatorship, and all this brought to different experiences, different representations of all this, of all these events. So I will give the floor to Pamela so that she can continue with the rest of the presentation. Thank you, Francisca. Well, first and foremost, I want to salute each one of you, and I want to thank the coalition team and all the mentors that have guided us in this path. To give you a little bit of context, these images are very important because they represent the context where the Memory and Feminism program was born, and that has enabled us to include the gender perspective in a cross-cutting fashion, and it is translated in the framework of correcting the record in the specific case of building in gender perspective and the main sample on the main exhibit. Why? Well, Francisca, can you please go to the next slide? Thank you. Why? Because the main exhibit in the museum somehow represents the narrative, the official narrative of the institution regarding the society as a whole and the country, and the violations of human rights that took place during the dictatorship. As Francisca mentioned, the gender perspective with a feminist outlook is very important because it makes visible those women as active subjects of social life, social, political, economic life, and acknowledges women as part of those social and political and historical events. Even though this approach emerges of the production of feminist knowledge, and in our case, the context of the social issues that took place with different feminist groups and organizations, there is a perspective of feminist or gender to differentiate it from other processes that have been burocratized and partialized, that take away from their philosophical and analytical capacity, which is translated into instrumental approaches and not transformative processes. Therefore, correcting the record, there have been 2 diagnostic processes carried out, and by correcting the record, with the aim of materializing the findings in this process is in paying attention to practices and internal structure through questions and looking inwards. So the approach was a theoretical framework that enabled us to identify different cultural, aspects, as well as political, social, and institutional aspects, both national and international, plus an analysis of this exhibition. For the second diagnosis, we worked with the input delivered in the first experience, but following a methodology and a feminist epistemology that stated a research scope through dialogue where participants would share with us their experiences, their life experiences and stories, and those observations about the main exhibit. In this process, this process was translated into a museum, a project that will be totally or completely or permanently exhibited. This participation diagnosis, that's how we call it, included 11 interviews that were not only individual. We had also some group interviews. So we had a larger number of people, not only 11 women. And we talked about the dictatorship, sexual violence, indigenous women, violence in political prosecution, women in human rights organisms, women in exile, and international organizations. And we also addressed as part of this interviews women that are part of the museum's directory. So as a result, we had three themes, three core themes that are part of our case study that are translated into this museum project or this mainstreaming project. The first one, well, violence, sexual violence. What we are working now on has to do with the consensus we reached as a result of the interviews conducted in the second participation diagnosis or participative diagnosis. This first axis of this political and sexual violence considers a specific systematic type of violence that attacks female bodies, so that it's part of an institutional project, therefore, that tries to address this consequence of the regime. So this was translated into a project that will be installed. We included quotes and testimonials in order to build in or to include the victims. The second axis, which has to do more with political issues, had to do with the consequences women suffered in the private and public spheres and during the dictatorship. So in order to make visible what happened in the political practice in the public space, this has been virtually invisible. So the main challenge of the project, and can we please go to the next slide?
Pamela, you need to wrap up now.
These are images of processes. This is the diagram that explains the exhibition. Here we have political and sexual violence, the exhibition on political and sexual violence, also the movement of women settlers in the dictatorship, also milestones in the public space and their impact on the defense of women's human rights. And this is a view of what this project entails. And the most important thing to mention is what were the biggest challenges in the project? The first one, generally speaking, was the lack of resources and addressing the tension that is created in feminist projects and institutions, also trying to institutionalize these practices and sustain them over time, and also to have this, to involve the outlook of feminist women in the conceptual definitions, the current feminist women in the conceptual definitions. Next slide, please. How did we solve them? The most important thing was to set certain times and project the beginning and end of the museum, setting deadlines, also trying to address tensions and expectations of our communities, because this type of exercise includes a strong sentiment of repairing the effects of those who were victims and survivors of a dictatorship. Also activating spaces for listening as a work methodology. The spaces for remediation. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela. Sorry about that, but we've gone over the time.
Okay.
But thank you for that overview of the lessons that you have learned and the processes you employed. I'd like to invite Folade to share your presentation next.
Thank you, Radhika. And I hope that everyone is hearing me. Thank you for the opportunity to learn over the last 2 days. The invaluable information shared will guide our work as an organization in the near and also in the distant future. The approach to my presentation is to introduce Vinod, to talk briefly about what we set out to do in this project, to reflect a bit on our key findings and the meanings for us, and share some insights into the case study. And I will end with some brief personal reflections. Slide 1, is it up? Yes, thank you. So this is who we are. We're a women's organization that works to advance the rights of women and girls. Can we have the next slide, please? And this is what we set out to do. We set out to develop a strategy for celebrating women's leadership. Can we have the next slide, please? And in terms of what we found in assessing the gap, this is what we found in our assessing the gap, the analysis of our systems. The gap for us is representation of our primary community in policy making and programming. And that came about because we never really invested in identifying our primary community. Rather, we proclaim as an organization that we represent women, you know, as if women are a homogeneous group. So we set about focusing on reviewing and strengthening our purpose and our policy so as to prevent gaps in representation in decision-making, particularly so as to enable more relevant policy making and programming on our part. Next slide, please. And so our case study was to engage in a process that produced recommendations for how to successfully set up a women's museum. And we felt that process and people were critical and the critical success factors for advancing our women's museum concept. And so a participatory process was important for us to pursue in order to institutionalize an alternative process for decision-making in all of our programming. We also got to test our ability to manage multiple interests and expectations by convening a diverse, high-achieving planning committee to produce our methodology and our recommendations. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. And so accepting that our primary community was not represented where it matters created urgency in the organization to correct this gap. And so the case study allowed us to test a methodology of stakeholder effective participation from the beginning of this project. Can we have the next slide, please? And so I want to talk quickly about our planning committee, because the selection of this cross-functional team of 8 persons is also filling the gap for us, filling that gap of effective representation and participation. Because although this team led the project, for us as an organization, the opportunity to work and to learn from this team is really invaluable. And so there was a lot of learning for us as an organization, not only in sort of mobilizing this talent, but also benefiting from their knowledge and experience and so on. And so what we're looking at presently is a photo of most of the team. Just 2 people are not represented. And this was our visit to the Central Bank Museum that hosted one of our meetings, one of our team meetings. And so from my left is Hyacinth Rampasad Singh at the end, and I'm standing next to her. And next to me is Ann Thomas, and behind is Ken Critchlow, and next to him in red is Joan Osborne, and at the end is Naima Muakil Zakuri. And the young woman in the middle with the envelope was our note taker, Taisha Blackman. And I just wanted to, I like to name names, not only because it's important for us to put a name to a picture, but to also kind of solidify in our consciousness. And so that is most of our team there. Like I said, 2 people missing, because we set out to mobilize a diverse group of women and men with demonstrable competence and accomplishments in leadership and management within the art sector, within the feminist and women's movement sector, community leadership and cohesion, public policy, and museum curating. But in addition, we took into account some of the tensions that exist in a post-colonial society, such as ethnicity, geographical representation, classism, and access to power and resources. And in considering the intersectionality of identities, we were able to respond with a team that brings together women and men whose life work intersects with women's extraordinary and everydayness leadership. I'll give you 2 examples. In my country, there is this historical tension in the women's movement about the visibility of Indian women in the research around women's activism, particularly Hindu women. We also have a situation which is a result of, it's a remnant of our colonial legacy, and that is the socio-political tensions between Trinidad and Tobago. And so projects such as ours, building a museum, feminizing narratives, must respond to those tensions. And so consequently, the committee's composition was 25% Indian women, actually Hindu women, and 12.5% Tobago representation. The team designed and rolled out 6 of the 8 stakeholder consultations that we planned. The output is a 2023 plan of action for the launch of the museum on November 25th, 2023. The stakeholders we consulted included women leaders in underserved communities. This was a really important grouping for us to reach out to because of the social discrimination that they experience in the country. We also met with women leaders from NGOs and the arts. We met with leaders in the differently abled community, rural women, the women of Tobago, and young women. Our consultations will continue in the first quarter of 2023 with professional women, state agencies, and business and faith organizations. During this period, we will also meet, that's the first quarter in 2023, with all stakeholders that we've been meeting with over the last few months. to present the findings of the consultations. And so far, 3 themes have emerged that are quite common as we kind of analyze the contributions that people have been making in the consultations. The first theme is process. People are talking about the need for community leadership through community-based activities that are designed by residents and are linked to national programs or national campaigns, and activities such as walls of fame and walls of remembrance. Those are activities that keep coming, that the people keep referring to and asking for. Another thing that's percolating is the business of roving museum, a roving museum and pop-up activities, again in communities, to raise awareness and consciousness raising and for public education. The second theme is services. Women are talking about psychological, in the physical space, having, along with the exhibits and so on, space for psychological counseling, childcare, support groups, and business activities, and creating a safe space really and an inclusive space, and even having, ensuring that we have residences and internships as part of the museum culture and operations. And then the third area is what has been excluded, you know, and there is consensus that our collective lived experience has really become invisible in the approach that is currently in use, that is of awarding excellence and extraordinary achievements, and that we really need to memorialize our everydayness. And so the main recommendation from our project and from this case study is the launch committee. This will be a diverse group of experts and practitioners that will take responsibility for launching the museum in November 2023. And so, for example, the project has been offered 2 properties by the government. Completion to house the physical elements of the museum requires specific competencies as well as financing, of course. And so this will be a major output of the launch committee. Can we have the next slide, please? And so our final slide is our thank you. And it's a thank you really for listening to the presentation, but also it also introduces our thanks for the opportunity to participate with some personal reflections of the learning and the gratitude that we have. You know, the assumption that the community called women is sufficient has proven to be wholly insufficient and impracticable for WINAD's work. And consequently, we have developed neither policy nor procedure for stakeholder or primary community input into the direction of our programming and our operations. But WINAD has built a culture of affirming and celebrating each other and any woman who comes into our space, really. But that too has proven insufficient since we have not simultaneously analyzed our ability to manage difficult narratives. So correcting the record for us is about inclusivity in our internal structure and procedures, but also our external process of memorialization. And so we are very grateful to the this Correcting the Record project for this awakening. And please know that we are committed to continuing this work because it is only going to strengthen our ability to provide the quality service that we pride ourselves on. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Falade. Thank you for finishing within the time limit. I'd like to invite Rose now. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Radhika. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good evening from wherever you are. Thank you, Radhika, for the introduction, but also thank you for correcting the report, and the International Sites of Conscience for giving us an opportunity from Uganda to participate in correcting the report project. And before perhaps I go through the slides, I want to let the participants know that as an institution, on behalf of the women of Uganda, we are planning to establish both a virtual but also a physical museum, and it is specifically going to be for women, which is going to be the East African Women's Museum. We are thinking and believe that our narratives as African women, but also as East African women, have for long been left in the dark, and our contribution, our struggles, our triumphs have not been entirely celebrated, but also we haven't had an opportunity to tell our own stories. And so having an opportunity to participate in correcting the report project for us was a privilege to learn, mostly to unlearn and to build our capacity. Over to the next slide. And we look forward to having the East African Women's Museum. And we hope that we are going to record, remember, and rewrite our narrative. Yes, move to the next slide. Yeah, and our purpose as the Women Rights Initiative with the East African Women's Museum, it's going to be an extension of our work at WORI, and it will be the first museum of its kind in East Africa. And we are dedicated to revealing the rich, diverse, and overlooked history of the women of Uganda and throughout the East African region. We hope that the museum is going to work to provide a diverse, nuanced, and historical record of Ugandan women's struggles and also our triumphs. And we hope that the exhibitions will examine the challenges posed by historical legacies of colonialism and patriarchy as they pertain to enduring gendered forms of inequality. While at this, at the same time, problematizing the mainstream historical accounts which served to erase women's contributions ultimately in society, politically, socially, geographically through a variety of exhibitions. And we will combine archival sources, historical artifacts, women's written and oral testimonies, and multimedia projects. And we hope to encourage healing and dialogue, and to empower the visitors and participants with knowledge and skills to recognize and confront gendered forms of inequality in their own communities. Next. So during the process of engaging with the Correcting the Record program, we had key findings, especially with assessing the gap. We noticed and interrogated and found out that our primary community was not being engaged entirely in decision-making, and there were a lot of inconsistencies in the process of traditional ways of documenting the stories of women. The women were not involved in all stages, and that was something that we found out as a huge gap. And of course, the way we documented was very traditional, because we entirely were deciding on how their stories would be told. And of course, we had ineffective tools as a team and machinery to be able to effectively document the stories for our survivors. When I talk about survivors, we work with survivors of domestic violence because we run the largest women's shelter in Uganda that supports survivors of domestic violence. So when you see survivors, keep in mind that we are talking about the women that are survivors of domestic violence. Next slide. So because of those gaps we identified, we developed a case study, and it was about collecting the stories by acquiring and employing different means and medias of storytelling to ensure that women can tell their stories in a comfortable and empowering way that reflects their personality. But also, we aimed at building the knowledge base of the staff and survivors on how to capture and document the stories using advanced technology and emerging tools of storytelling. That was something that we took on as a case study because for us that felt important, considering the gaps we had identified. Next. And we had a goal to collect and portray between 5 to 7 stories from a variety of female survivors that we had worked with or that we were working with. Next slide. And in that journey of learning, both the staff and the survivors, we were cognizant of having self-authorship, ensuring that the survivors and the staff are undergoing empowerment, ensuring that as we take those stories, we are taking them in a non-reducing way, putting into consideration inclusiveness as a huge factor in documenting and archiving those stories, and ensuring that there is autonomy and unharming the survivors as they participate into this activity. Next slide. Yeah, I have pictures of staff, but also with some of the survivors undergoing a survivor's capacity building on documentation and storytelling, just like you can see. Next slide. So how did we address those gaps? So we had 3 different ways through which we agreed, and so that they would be relevant in addressing the gaps that we identified. One was through starting with the survivors. The process of addressing the gap of inclusiveness enabled participation for survivors as our primary and target audience at all project stages. We enabled them have an increased voice and gave them agency as survivors in telling their own stories and increasing their autonomy to decide how and when and where and with who they wanted to tell their story with. At staff level, we were able to learn methods and techniques for both staff and survivors in regards to storytelling. That has made it possible for us to have the stories documented. We have 7 stories documented differently that are ready to share. And for us, that's a lot of learning, a lot of unlearning, and inclusiveness in terms of the knowledge and the skills that we have acquired over time. And of course, when you look at the capacity, the project enabled us to acquire engage in learning, and they made the documentation of the stories more easier. There was a lot of unlearning and learning while we were engaging with them, and so we can't take that for granted. We know that a lot of those gaps that we identified were met. Next. Yeah, that's a picture of one of our staff as we were participating in the training workshop. We faced a few challenges, and one of the challenges that we faced was adjusting. As the Women's Rights Initiative, we have a smaller team, and so adjusting to the enormous process of documentation, because all of us know that documentation is not a one-day thing, but it's also not a one-person activity. Is a process that involves quite a number of people. So it was also challenging for us to have adjustments, considering that we also still have other work that we do, and that to us was quite challenging. But we were able to assemble a co-creation team and also task each member with specific responsibilities based on their ability, and we were able to accomplish the tasks that were ahead of us. Next. Yeah, we want to thank you for having let us be a part of this learning journey. We are sure that a lot of learning has been done, especially in the way we document, in the way we have inclusion, in the way we look at our our primary beneficiaries and the importance that each stakeholder brings on board. And we want to say that in between this process, we also underwent a process of developing a profile for the museum and a museum layout that we will share later in the Padlet. And we are looking forward to the journey of establishing a virtual museum and later on having a physical museum that celebrates our triumphs, that also openly talks about our struggles, but also that tells our stories the right way they should be told. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rose, for staying well within your time. Now I'd like to I'd like to open up the floor for questions. And if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand in the chat box or the question there. We can get to it. Yeah.
Radhika, sorry. No, we said that we think that the question and answers will be open after the next session.
Okay, perfect.
So,
okay.
Yeah, so we will just have a 10 minutes break and then we will meet back for the second cohort. And after that, we will have a question and answer session on the 6 case studies. Yeah. So I don't know if you want Radhika to say a few words to close the session.
Yes, so I'll just sort of quickly close the session. Yes?
Yeah, would be great.
Hello?
Yeah, Radhika, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So thank you to the 3 panelists for sharing your thoughts. And I think some of the very clear messaging that came across is the fact that systemic silences of how systemic silences need to be identified and assessed in all of these contexts. And in doing so, that we can actually look at how representation, what it means to represent, what it means to actually have inclusivity, and how that affects decision making, not just in representing the women and their work and activities. For example, in the first presentation, socioeconomic, political ways in which women have played a role in public space in defense of human rights, and the requirement to change the paradigm and change the lens from which women are looked at in the representation of women in these public events, but also in the second instance in WINET, where internal assessments of representation and inclusivity can actually affect the way and affect and influence the way external memorialization and perspective and policy making can happen by bringing in the women that are excluded even from those narratives of memorialization. To what Rose was talking about, that this kind of process that documented experience of domestic violence differently actually enabled a process of developing a lens that will benefit the museum that they were actually developing simultaneously to this project. So I think clearly the ability, what we've learned is the assessment of representation and inclusivity has led to ways in which we can look at how to record, as Rose said, record, remember, and rewrite history and rewrite women back into the historical narrative. So thank you very much for sharing your experiences and your case studies. I'm very sorry if I had to cut you off because of the time, but you've all given very great presentations and they're available on the Padlet for anyone else to see as well. So we'll ask questions later, but thank you all.
I just wanted to, before we close, just make a last comment, which I think is relevant for those who wish to apply the methodology in future, once it's turned into a toolkit now, which is our next step. The 3 examples presented here, the 3 case studies, are from organizations with very different structures and stages of development in their institutional journeys. So, Museo de la Memoria de los Derechos Humanos in Chile is a very well-established museum, a large-scale museum, a state organization, and the merit of applying the methodology for them was to question practices that are already established and entrenched, and how to disrupt certain practices that were hindering their ability to feminize these narratives. In the case of WINAD, it was essential the fact that they could use the framework as a planning document, as Folade was saying. Because they are in the beginning stages of implementing their women's museum, or if it's not called a museum, their women's memorial center in Trinidad and Tobago. This was a very good opportunity to have an inclusive co-creation approach from inception and ask the right questions as they are embarking on this journey. And similarly with Rose, who's opening a new branch in their practices as a well-established human rights organization, but also branching more deeply into memorializing the histories and stories and narratives of women in East Africa. This was crucial for them to, as she says, and I love that, and it's mostly like unlearned practices, for example, linked to documentation, to relearn how documentation can serve purposes of both accountability, but also memorialization and creating agency for women. So that is to say that this framework can be applied to whichever various stages of development organizations are at. And in its way becomes a useful tool to question and establish practices that are inclusive at any stage of your journey as an organization. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, JJ, and thank you, Radhika, for the great moderation. Thank you so much to Pamela, Francesca, Folade, and Rose for this brilliant presentation. So as I said, we're gonna have a question and answer session after the next session where the three other project partners will be presenting their case studies. But for now, let's just take a coffee break of 10 minutes. So we will regroup and meet back at 7:40 EST. So see you in a few minutes. Thank you all again.